Najveći međunarodni festival dokumentarnog filma u regiji.
Je najbolje od dokumentarnog filma u svijetu.
Welcome to this talk, Jess.
Hello. Hi, nice to see you.
Yeah, so I will, because this whole program is available on YouTube, so maybe some of our viewers have not seen it yet, I will give a short introduction. So Divided Cities is a series of 5 short documentaries, stories about cities that reflect major global divisions. So there we have Havana, where taxi drivers make more money than doctors. Nicosia, in Cyprus, which is split between Greece and Turkey, and where in both parts military service is necessary. Memphis in the States, dubbed the hunger camp, where the poor neighborhoods have food. New Delhi, where poor neighborhoods are not protected from the increasing heat. And Melilla, a Spanish city in the Moroccan territory, where immigrants from Africa tried to immigrate to Europe, and the local right-wing politician wants to build a Trump-style wall. So, Jess, can you tell us how you started with this project and what was the idea behind it?
Yeah, sure. So this was quite an unusual project for us, because usually we put one film out at a time rather than doing a series. And usually we're making films around specific news headlines. So this was actually quite a sort of privileged situation. It was commissioned by Guardian Cities, which is a specific department at The Guardian, who are partly funded by the Rockefeller Foundation. So it just means that sort of that the whole series operated slightly different to the rest of our kind of video output. Which essentially meant that we had more time. So we had a whole year to put this series together. And it meant that rather than chasing a news story, we could sort of sit back and think about a big theme that we could take quite a sort of unusual perspective on. And when we started on this, which was, I think, the beginning of 2019 or the end of 2018, we were in the throes of Brexit conversation. Trump had come into power for 2 years, and it just felt like division was the main theme that we were talking about. So we wanted to take the theme of divided, and because it was a commission for Guardian Cities, it was looking at division in cities specifically. And so that was our starting point. And then we just started to put together a long list of cities, and we were also trying to cover the sort of big global themes of our times right now. So climate change, migration, inequality. And then we were looking for cities that were really interesting case studies around those topics. So we started off with a long list, and then we just kept sort of bringing it down.
Yeah. And so how does this function production-wise? I mean, in the sense of after you've identified which cities and stories you would cover. So what is then the next step? How do you, and also did this issue of access and production opportunities influence your decisions which cities to pick?
Yeah, so our team was pretty tiny. We had the commissioning editor from Guardian Cities, who's called Chris Michael. Then I'm an executive producer from our video department. And then we had 2 freelancers work on it. So we had someone called Anita Jones, who was the producer across the whole series. And then we had a filmmaker and editor, a guy called Max Duncan, who also worked across the whole series. So it was really only 4 of us working on it for a year. Which actually is much easier when you've got one team working across a whole series, because often in our video department at a news organization, you're sort of fighting to get an editor to work on this project. But it was quite nice to know you've got the same team working across 5 projects. And also quite a rarity for us to have freelancers working for that length of time on a project. But also that means that they sort of bring in new skills, like the filmmaker and editor. He, as you can see in the series, was really good at sort of graphics. So that's why it's got quite a sort of stylish look to it and quite a lot of graphical content. And also he was a brilliant shooter as well. So it was great to have him editing and shooting the whole thing and just keeping it all very minimal. So it was on a very low budget, the entire thing. And in terms of access, our producer, I mean, she worked so hard on this project. The original plan was to always find two characters who would show either side of a division within a city, so that we could have them sort of up against each other as examples of two different lives living in the same sort of locale. So the producer had to do a lot of casting. Well, first of all, she had to do so much research into the history of that city and its connection to the topic that we were exploring, and then had to cast for it. So, which is quite hard to do remotely. I mean, now it's even harder, but then it was pretty tricky. Yeah, I mean, I think we were quite lucky. I suppose because none of the films we were working on were breaking news stories, it was quite easy. We had quite a sort of flexibility in the characters we were looking for. So hopefully we had quite a good range of people. But something I think we're always really wary of is sometimes people will sign up to be in a Guardian video, forgetting that, you know, thousands and thousands of people will view it and it will be available forever online. So I think we have a responsibility to make sure that anybody that agrees to be in any of our films really understands the sort of impact that it could potentially have on their lives if it's quite a controversial topic.
So did you have some people who you thought would speak and then they gave up, or were there any situations like that?
I think everyone who agreed to be in it stayed in it. Though it did mean that in the edit, there were quite a few sentences that had to come out. You know, The Guardian has final editorial control on everything, but we always want to make sure that the contributors are happy with how they're being presented and that there's nothing in there that they think could be problematic for them. So I know the edit was always quite a tricky one to make sure that each of the characters felt well represented. So yeah, so nobody pulled out, thankfully, but it was, yeah, it's all kind of came down to the edit.
Yeah. So, yeah. Well, I think this approach where you show these divisions through characters is really very, how they say, a documentary technique, as opposed to something that would be called current affairs or news. So, and in this way, I think it also, because these things should be topical, as we would call them, and so that even if a certain topic falls out of the public focus in a moment, this is still valid. And but with this series, it seems to actually gain on topicality as the time goes by and as we get more aware of the divisions.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's interesting that we started coming up with this idea in 2018 when we thought, wow, you know, the world's really at this sort of epic divisive moment, having no idea that 2 years later it'd be even worse than what we were experiencing then. So yeah, it's quite interesting going back to thinking about that commissioning process and, you know, the things that were dividing us now and then the world we live in now. It's really interesting. I guess just talking to your first point about observational documentary filmmaking, I think our video team is constantly thinking how we can complement other journalists who are essentially writing articles on a topic that are sort of newsworthy articles, whereas what we can do in video is sort of visually give a kind of visceral feel for people's lives. So take the headlines and take the news stories, but then put it into sort of everyday situations. So whenever people pitch projects to us, we always ask, first of all, is this an article or is this a video? And we'll only commission it if it can only be told as a video. And often people pitch things to us where it's got a whole load of context, but it doesn't really have any story, and it doesn't really have any particularly unique access. So I think characters and people and everyday storylines are really important for us, because it's the sort of unique offering of video in a news organization.
Yeah. And so which of the I found all these videos really interesting, and all the content is obviously very important, but maybe the most surprising one was the Memphis story. And this was also something that's really visual, with these empty lots and rundown parts of the city, and just going into this how would you call this low-income grocery store where there is only chips and soda. And, so how did you go personally to Memphis when you were doing this?
No, I didn't, but Anita, our producer, went over there. And I think she was really lucky, because the main character, the woman who sort of talks you through the whole film, she found her quite early on. And she's just brilliant. She's so part of the community, and she's a real kind of community leader in tackling food deserts as an issue. And what's quite interesting is, post this film being made, so that was the film that did best online. It got amazing viewing figures. And a few months after it went out on The Guardian, Kruger, which is a massive supermarket chain, has now set about trying to set up a supermarket in one of the low-income areas in South Memphis. So they've started doing like mobile supermarkets there that sort of drive to specific neighborhoods. And if that's successful, they'll hopefully bring a supermarket to one of the areas that we were referring to. So, I mean, I don't know that we can credit the film for doing that, but it certainly instigated quite a big debate in the comments underneath the film. I think it was the film that most people were surprised by. And, and interestingly, in other countries, they're sort of saying how, the healthy, fresh fruit and vegetables are the cheapest things to buy in their country. And it's the processed stuff that's expensive. Whereas in America, it's the other way around. Yeah.
And it was... It's interesting also with Memphis to focus. This is something I was thinking about when I was preparing for this talk. So these divisions are essentially economic ones, but this is also tied with racial divisions. And did you decide to really to start from the economic ones? Did you maybe consider doing something that starts from the like a racial division point?
I think the starting point for that film actually was inequality. So we were trying to find a city that had massive inequality. And Memphis has this really major life expectancy gap. So those people that live in wealthy areas are likely to live for 13 years longer than those people that live in poorer areas. And we just thought, in the same city, that's incredible that you could have such a massive life expectancy gap. And then sort of from that point, we worked backwards into seeing that food poverty was one of the biggest issues there. And then that was immediately linked to race. So actually I don't think race was the starting point. I think inequality was the starting point, and that was just inextricably linked to race. And I think the sort of historic connection to this thing called redlining, which our main character describes in the film, but it's about how money lending companies lent money back in like the 1920s, and they had a red line around areas that they wouldn't lend money to. And amazing that in 2019, when we were filming, it's still pretty much the same redlining area. So I think that sense that things don't really change that quickly, that's a sort of century of no change, is somewhat depressing.
Yeah. I think these also in other films, these economic aspects are also surprising. For instance, I had no idea about this, what they call a typical economy or distribution with others between the Spanish and Moroccan part.
Yeah. Yeah, that was fascinating because, I mean, we set out to make a film about migration because Spain at that point was the biggest entry point for migrants into the EU. And as a consequence of that, the far-right party, Vox, seemed to be doing really well in Parliament. So we thought, okay, well, there's our migration story. And, you know, it talks about borders and the sort of Vox slogan was "Make Spain Great Again." So we thought it really kind of tied into that whole sort of right-wing movement of anti-immigration. But then while we were researching that story, we discovered this whole other story about Morocco and Spain and about this bizarre sort of loophole where Moroccan porters can help carry traded goods across the border and be paid around €10 a day for it. But it's a completely bizarre anomaly. and these Moroccans are sort of queuing for hours on end, and you get all ages doing it. And it just seemed a sort of bizarre extra story on this whole sense of like borders and what's going in and what's coming out and who's allowed to cross and who's allowed to take what. And it felt like it was an important part of the story and one that very few people know about. So that's a sort of third character, where usually we have two characters. We included a third in that episode.
Yeah. And what was also, I mean, it was surprising to me that in this Melia documentary, there is this data that 1 out of 4 asylum seekers get asylum. And to me, this sounded like, oh, that's not so bad, you know, because you get this impression that, it really depends on what media you're following. But my impression, and I'm one of the people who really follows Guardian. So my impression was that the situation was probably much worse.
Yeah, I mean, I think the issue is trying to get into the EU. I think that's why they're all so happy when they get in, because they've got a 1 in 4 chance of staying, which, you know, depending on your perspective is good or bad. But I think the sort of the difficulty for all of those migrants is just getting across the border. So that's what we were trying to show in that story, that, yeah, once they're in, they do have hopefully a reasonably good chance of asylum. But it's just trying to cross these borders and walls to get in. And like one of the characters says in Spain, you know, the Spanish side, they sort of tried to follow EU law, but at the same time, they know that by Morocco having quite, you know, aggressive razor-wired barbed wire on their wall, it's helping keep asylum seekers out of Spain. So I think it was quite interesting what that immigration lawyer is saying, that yes, Spain is sort of supposedly following EU law, but at the same time, then they're not asking Morocco to bring down their walls. And in a way that they've just passed the responsibility over to Morocco to make sure none of these migrants cross the borders.
Yeah, this is what's happening with this whole crisis, is this sending responsibility to the other side. So yeah. EU gives it to Turkey, then Turkey does what it does, and then and here you have Morocco protecting Spain. Yeah. And another interesting parallel economy story is in Havana, with two currencies which we are aware of. But it was really interesting to see this change and development from when Obama restarted these relations between the States and Cuba, and then Trump came and rolled back on it. So that's it makes you feel for Cuban people that this is really you get some hope again, and then something happens that kind of slashes it down.
Yeah, it's interesting with that film. Across the whole series, we didn't want to make this about Brexit or Trump. So we sort of feel like they're such obvious characters in a story about division that we were trying to really avoid those two topics. And then when it came to Cuba, Trump was such a big part of the division there now. But we were sort of wary to make him the story. So yeah, we were trying to tell the whole timeline of events and seeing, you know, his place in this final chapter, or, you know, the chapter we're in now. But it's interesting that with Obama, he tried to open up relationships with Cuba, which brought in a whole load of foreign money, and you know, business was booming. But that also added to this issue of there being this real discrepancy between tourist foreign currency coming in and the local currency. But at least there was just more money in the country. And now there's just so little, and you see this stockpiling happening and everybody going into this sort of state of panic. And there's this sort of knock-on effect that, and, you know, I think our characters in that film are really interesting, because the female character, who's a doctor, she really wanted to state that she thinks that there's so much that of good of the socialist system in Cuba, and she's really proud that their medical system is one of the best in the world, and that she's part of that. And the other character, who's a doctor, who then gives up being a doctor to be a taxi driver because he can earn in an hour what he'd earn in a month as a doctor. But he has this real thing about saying, I'm not proud to be a taxi driver, I was proud to be a doctor and serve my community. And I think it's really interesting, this very sort of socialist attitude of like what your contribution to society is. And then also just having to survive and live. And, you know, the doctor, who is a doctor at the moment, she can't live off her salary. So her husband has to give up his job as a teacher and do a sort of more commercially facing job. So I think that sort of dichotomy of people saying, you know, our economy just doesn't work because we're entirely reliant on foreign dollars coming in. But at the same time, there's certain aspects of our society that we're all really proud of and that we sort of want to hang on to. I kind of like the nuance of that, you know, those characters aren't all saying everything's terrible here. There's certain parts of it that they're really proud of, but, you know, they just don't have a functioning economy when they're so reliant on foreign aid.
Yeah. And earlier, when we were talking about this Havana part, you said you wanted to avoid focusing too much on these obvious things like Brexit or Trump, but it's inevitable. It's in each and every of these stories, it comes up. Like in the Delhi story, it comes up with the global warming aspect. And,
yeah.
So this was, it's a really shocking bit of info that you have there, that if the global warming continues on the level that it is now, if nothing is done about it, that by the end of the century, it will be literally impossible to live in Southeast Asia. Yeah. I mean, yeah, that story was really amazing. It was actually the hardest film to make because India didn't want to give us access to film there. I think India's quite wary of The Guardian. So it was such an obvious story to cover, but really hard to get access to it. And, you know, we picked Delhi, but we could have just as easily picked Australia as well. You know, that all these countries that are on the front line of climate change and are sort of witnessing such tremendous change. You know, I think the way these characters are saying, we just never saw temperatures like this a few years ago, and now people are dying in the summer because it's so hot, and young people as well. I think that's what's interesting about our character that dies in that film. He's only in his 40s, but it's just from working outdoors all day in temperatures that are up to 48 degrees. So yeah, it's such a common trend that we're seeing. And, you know, I don't think these stories are unique to Delhi or India. And as we know, very little is being done about it. And that's what's so terrifying, that we're at this critical period where temperatures are the hottest they've ever been on record. And we're at a moment where things have to change. And that's unlikely to happen if Trump gets re-elected. So,
I think that film really shows you that we're in a moment where, you know, drastic change needs to happen. And in some ways, the thing that I feel sort of hopeful about with COVID is that drastic change it does happen and can happen, and people can adapt in a very drastic way if they have to. And I hope that there's a sort of lesson to be learned from that like, as human beings, we're amazingly adaptable. And if we need to, and if we're told we've got to do this, we will. It's sort of, no one would have expected this situation. But it has taught us a huge lesson. I mean, the entire world has completely adapted their lifestyle from one week to the next. I can't even imagine if someone had told me in early March that I was going to spend the next 7 or 8 months working from my bedroom, not going to see any of my colleagues again for that. I would never have believed it, but that's what we all have to do, and we do it. So I hope that sort of lesson can be carried over to climate change measures as well.
Yeah, this is something that seems kind of obvious now, that we are adaptable and so on, but this is to translate this into real policies, that's another issue. Yeah,
that's why I guess we just need to have leaders and governments that are able to do that, and they're all too afraid to do that. That's why this election is going to be so meaningful.
You mentioned now that India is wary of The Guardian. Can you tell me what you mean, and why is this, and what does this mean practically? Obviously, you need some permits to make this in the place where you want to make it. So how is it, who do you go to for the permit, and what did they tell you? What is the problem?
Well, it just took a really, really long time, and we were sort of told it would take a matter of weeks, and then they just weren't getting back to us for a very long time. And then we sort of heard via other people that, you know, our coverage on Kashmir made them wary of allowing Guardian journalists in there. So, I mean, that's a thing that we have to sort of be really wary of, is that we've got so many separate departments all working on different projects, and it's that sort of balancing act of making sure we're not burning our bridges for our other colleagues to report on things. Obviously we need to be reporting on everything and making sure we're covering all the major stories, but yeah, it was an interesting situation, because this was a sort of non-essential news story, but we felt that Delhi was the best place to tell this story. I mean, we did also look at like the Philippines and other countries in Southeast Asia that we could have gone to, but I think we just thought that Delhi had also the sort of strongest inequality there as well. Visually, it was really easy to tell the story. And to be honest, because we filmed it over a year ago, I can't remember how we eventually they came round to it, but we were waiting and waiting and waiting for it all to happen. In fact, no, I do know what happened. We weren't allowed there, but we got in an Indian production company to make the project with us producing it. So we had to produce it all remotely. So actually, it really was the hardest episode to make, because as I was saying before, all the other episodes, we had the same team across it. So they have a very sort of similar visual style. But when it came to India, we had an Indian production company shoot it all. So we just didn't have the same control that we'd had on the other episodes. So, you know, that's a sort of production issue that I feel like you have to always have your sort of plan A, plan B, plan C, especially when you're working with such a tight schedule and such a tight budget. And, you know, you have to make these sort of big decisions really quickly, of whether you're going to fly two colleagues out to Delhi imminently. You know, we kept being told that we were going to get the permit, and then it just never came through. All the while we're sort of wondering whether we should be booking flights and booking hotels. And then we just realized it just wasn't going to come. It had been months and months, and they still weren't issuing us a permit. And we had to get that film made. And we decided on India and done all our research in India and found all our characters in India. So it had to be there. So the only option left to us was to find a local production company who could shoot it all.
Well, it didn't, to me, it didn't really stand out as a different style, or it was very clearly part of the same series. I mean,
oh, good. Okay, that's good to know.
I wouldn't be able, if you didn't say it, I wouldn't be able to tell it's not the same team who did it.
Okay, that's good. That's good.
All right, and so finally with Nicosia, this story is sort of, it feels a bit more, how should I say, like from another era. The story in Nicosia, because of this focus on this compulsory military service and how it is a hot issue there, especially in the Turkish part, as far as I can tell. And yeah, and you have these, but there is also, it's pretty easy for a viewer to understand, I think, because you have these young people who don't really see any real need to have military service. And then you have these old timers who are very traditional, the Turkish ones, who are like, no, of course, buddy, you're going to go to the army. You know, you have to do this.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think the fact that we put this whole series out on the 30-year anniversary of the Berlin Wall coming down, I think it sort of bears an interesting relationship to that, because it's that sense of, you know, this sort of passage of generations, and how for older generations that have lived through something, you know, it's hard for them to move on from that. Like one of our characters says, you know, he's like, my family were murdered by the Greeks. So I'm not gonna, I don't want to be friends with them. Like, it's good. The Turks and Greeks should be separate. And you can sort of empathize with that point of view. If your whole family's been murdered by one side, it must be very hard to move on from that. But then I guess that's the whole sort of healing process of new generations coming up that don't have that relationship to a situation. Just like with the Berlin Wall coming down, as time passes, you know, it's not a sort of emotively felt topic, and hopefully it makes things easier for people to sort of get over and progress. But I guess that's also the poignancy of this whole series, was that the Berlin Wall coming down was meant to sort of mark this moment of great unity, you know, Berlin being this sort of focal point for all these global divisions. And I think we thought it was so poignant that 30 years on, we're not looking at this like utopian vision of unity. We're actually looking at a whole load of other types of divisions. And, you know, there was just that one wall in Europe with the Berlin Wall in 1989. And now there are something like 15 border walls across Europe. So in many ways, you know, in some ways we're much more unified via the EU, but now living in the UK, I'm not part of that. And yeah, we just thought there was, something very poignant that 30 years ago was meant to mark this moment of unity. And then 30 years on, in 2019, we were looking at all sorts of other types of division that are just, and now 2 years on from making this series, feel even more amplified. Yeah.
Yeah, strange how history works. I mean,
yes.
When the Berlin Wall came down, there was this idea of unity and freedom and kind of understanding and supporting between the various former ideological enemies, let's say. But then it develops in a different way and produces something that's actually much worse than what was just the Berlin Wall, because all the smaller divisions are much harder to tackle, because it's they are not so, it's not like you have communism and capitalism east and the west. These are divisions that maybe come from the same frame of mind of this idea that we are good and they are bad. But now, so it's become so small, all these divisions, and now it seems like almost every person is an ideology.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, what I think is so interesting with Brexit is that the fault lines or the divisions of Brexit weren't like a clear party political line. You know, there are plenty of left-wing people that voted for Brexit, just as there's quite a lot of right-wing people that voted against it. So I think with Brexit, like the divisions that threw up was so multiple that it wasn't just capitalism versus communism style divide. It, you know, families were completely divided by the Brexit vote because you've got different generations thinking different things. You know, and within the Labour Party, for example, the Labour leader at the time, Jeremy Corbyn, he just wasn't able to say anything on Brexit because he just didn't know how to play it, because within his party he had such a mix of people who felt very differently about Brexit. That, I mean, he was criticised a lot for not really speaking out clearly on his views on Brexit, because he just knew that if he said anything definite on that topic, he would lose sort of half of his votership. So, yeah, I think what you're saying is interesting. Like previously, you're talking about one sort of major global division, and now it feels like that division is fractured into multiple parts. And it's just become incredibly complex. And you're right, we're all you sort of have to find your tribe and define yourself by that tribe. And it means that we all sort of lose our nuance as individuals.
Yeah. And so how is the feeling now in the UK about Brexit? Because it was maybe, I think, a lot of us were hoping that this would not eventually happen, but it's happening. How is the atmosphere now?
Yeah, it's weird. It feels like there's been many chapters to the story of Brexit. And I think so it was voted on in June 2016, and they had a campaign that went on for sort of 6 months before that. So I think before the vote happened, people like me, so London people, never really believed it would happen. And I think that was a big part of the problem. Like Westminster, London media, I don't think people really believed that it would happen. So it came as a huge shock in June 2016 when it did happen. And it was quite a massive awakening. You know, one of the main issues, I think, in the UK is that it's such a London-centric country. You know, all our resources are in London, and we're quite sort of disconnected to the rest of the country. You know, we don't have a sort of federal state or anything like that. And I think it's one of the major problems of this country. And I think a big part of the Brexit vote, there was this term that kept being used, the people that were left behind, i.e. the people that weren't profiting from globalization, like those in London and other major sort of metropolitan cities were. So I think when Brexit happened, it was a huge sort of wake up for everybody to really, and you know, and at The Guardian, who we're an anti-Brexit paper, but we recognised that this was a big division in the country, and that a lot of our readers would perhaps be pro-Brexit, and we needed to understand where they were coming from with that and make sure we were reflective of it, which I perhaps don't think we were before the vote happened. I think we just sort of didn't believe it would happen and didn't recognise how strong that Brexit voice was. And then I think for the next 2 years, so 2016 to 2018, 19, it just completely dominated all our media, and it was so dry. It was all about the sort of legal technicalities of, you know, the trade agreements and the hard border in Northern Ireland. And, you know, you turn on the radio and all it was were these sort of EU Brexit negotiators, and it was all very technical, and everybody was just fed up of hearing about Brexit, and no other sort of domestic politics were discussed. Everything was about Brexit. So I think in like end of 2018, early 2019, even those people who are anti-Brexit just wanted it to be done with. We all just wanted it to happen now because it was dragging on and on and on. That, you know, even The Guardian was saying, right, this is going to happen. It has to happen. What's the best way that it can happen? So we were all very wary of this no deal Brexit that Boris Johnson is always talking about and looks very much like it will happen now. And, you know, didn't want this sort of cliff edge that people were talking about. And I guess we were sort of saying, if this has to happen, what's the way that we can keep up good relationships with the EU? And, you know, we're all part of the same continent, and, you know, they're our neighbours. Let's not be ridiculous about our status in the world. Like, we are still reliant on the EU. And then COVID happened, and suddenly we all forgot about Brexit. And, you know, previously we were worried that it was going to be hard to travel abroad, or, you know, it's certainly it's hard having relationships abroad, or just, you know, what's it going to mean for our sort of multicultural society? And now, you know, I can't leave my house, let alone get on a plane to fly to the continent. Yeah. So now it feels like we've bizarrely really returned to sort of localism, and in some ways a celebration of localism, and like getting to know your local community, shopping locally, you know, slowing our lives down, not flying around the world. And I think there's something positive in that. But in other ways, it's sort of felt like Brexit is this thing of the past now, and we've sort of gone beyond Brexit. It's now like, what the hell is our planet doing now? I mean, we've gone back to talking about Brexit because you know, we're nearing a moment when we are just going to have a no deal Brexit, and the EU has now launched a legal case against the UK government for illegally. I mean, I don't even know all of the ins and outs of it all, but I know that Brexit has come back into being. But I think for the British people at the moment, we're all just struggling with this new life and a complete economic collapse. I mean, unemployment has just soared, and the knock-on effect of that is insane. And, you know, I sort of have a background in the arts, and I'm watching all these big cinema chains closing down, all these theatres closing down, and it just feels like culture is being wiped out. That Brexit just feels like irrelevant now. Yeah, that's my summary of Brexit.
No, I was because now it feels like we are talking about divisions. So it feels like now UK with Brexit happening is much more divided from Europe than it ever was, because there was a creation of European Union. The UK is in, but not completely, not Europe, not Schengen, and so on. But it was still sort of a feeling of, okay, we're in this together. But when Britain decided for Brexit, the feeling is, I think, in Europe that it's really very clearly said, we don't want to be part of this, and we are not with you. And you know, and there is, of course, in the background always this exceptionalism aspect in it. And yeah, I would say I would think that Europeans are kind of disappointed, but also in this have this maybe feeling of, oh, it serves you well, you know, that there's this which is really related to these divisions.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I always felt that Brexit didn't really have anything to do with the EU. It was much more about divisions within our own country. You know, to be honest, I don't think we've ever felt that European. And even me as a anti-Brexit, pro-EU person, you know, Brits rarely speak a foreign language competently. We've always had a stronger connection to the US. And yeah, I think Brexit wasn't really to do with the EU. It was much more a sort of domestic or national debate that the EU just sort of played into. And yeah, I mean, the UK has always had a very unique relationship to the EU. It's that sort of island mentality. You know, I always find it really interesting when I'm on the continent that you can just literally drive from one country to another. Whereas in the UK, you've got to get on a plane or a boat, or it's just it's a more of a sort of physical endeavor. But the idea of just literally driving along a motorway and going from one country to another with that sort of ease, I think that does change your mentality quite a bit.
Yeah. All right. Thanks, Jess. I'm going to, we have about 5 minutes left, so I'll see if there are any questions from the viewers. And meanwhile, I'll ask you about, I just saw on The Guardian, the new Belarus documentary. And
Yeah.
I read the interview with the 3 filmmakers that you published. So this is interesting. Can you tell our viewers maybe a bit more about this one? This was actually made in Belarus by these filmmakers. But did they commission it, or how did you?
So a Danish company called IMS contacted us, and I think they're Danish. I can't quite remember, but they put us in contact with these 3 filmmakers. So they had already been developing a story idea with them, or encouraging them to document what they were seeing. And so the moment we were put in contact with them, and we had to do it all via Telegram, they pretty much shot their films already. So we just took those 3 edits and decided that it would make it'd be easier for us to make it as one film. And so we just, the kind of final film was edited back at The Guardian with kind of constant collaboration with the filmmakers. And usually we prefer to work on projects from a sort of development stage onwards. So it's quite unusual to be sort of acquiring almost finished films, and to also have this sort of set of 3 films that we made into one. So that's not usually how we work, but it was so amazing to get such unique access to really great filmmakers with some really unique angles and perspectives, that with well shot films, that we had to turn that around really quickly. So usually we'd have a much longer sort of development and production process, but with this, we just felt very excited to have such good access to these filmmakers, and the fact that they were happy to be, named, and that we could do a proper Q&A with them to get sort of context to their filming was really great. Yeah.
So this is something that really clicked in the right moment.
Yeah, exactly. And I think so much of what we're doing is about that. That's why I always say to a filmmaker, if you pitch something to us and we decline it, don't think that that's the end of the story. Just keep pitching to us, because so much of our commission is about timing. So it's not necessarily that it's a bad proposal. It's just that, timing is so of the essence for us. That it's about getting your proposal in at the right time.
Yeah. Well, this is really, I saw it's a 20-minute film now, and it's available on The Guardian. I don't know if it's on YouTube as well, but
it is. Yeah.
So I would also point our viewers to that. It's called, I have to take a look.
It's called Belarus, Personal Stories from a Country in Turmoil.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's it. All right. Thanks, Jess. Unfortunately, we don't have any questions from the audience, but I hope this is because we were so thorough and interesting.
Yeah.
So those who haven't seen Divided Cities, they're available on YouTube. And you can also find the Belarus film. And I would like to thank Jess again for this very interesting talk. And also to say bye to our viewers and to tell them to enjoy the rest of ZagrebDox. Thank you, Jess.
Nice to meet you all. Thank you. Bye.
Najveći međunarodni festival dokumentarnih filmova.
Najbolje od dokumentarnog filma u svijetu.